Hi, everyone. I'm Kat Zakrzewski with Wall Street Journal Pro Venture Capital, and we're here today to talk about AI. Obviously, one of the hottest topics in Silicon Valley right now. If your inbox is anything like mine, it's something that it seems like every startup is mentioning in emails these days. So we've got a great panel. I'll ask them each to just take a minute to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their firm and maybe some recent AI investments that they've made.
My name is, can you guys hear me? Yes. My name is Ilya Kirnos. My background is in software. I was at Google for many years, and now I'm one of the founding partners at SignalFire, which is a San Francisco-based early-stage venture capital firm.
So my name is Dmitry. Do you hear me, by the way? Yeah, okay, nice. So my name is Dmitry Grishin. I'm founder of a company called Grishin Robotics. We are a venture firm which invests in hardware-related and robotics companies. Mostly our investment is where we see most of my investment is related to hardware and software, and where they combine together. Like, for example, delivery robots or some kind of bike-sharing system.
Sure. Igor Tabor, I'm a managing director with Intel Capital. Intel Capital, I think most of you probably know, is a venture arm of Intel, investing broadly in all aspects of technology. My role particularly focused around our data and analytics investment. I think they call it AI nowadays. But it's everything from data management, data infrastructure, all the way up to machine learning, deep learning, artificial intelligence type of companies.
And so, as you might see, we don't just have an AI panel here today, we have the Russian panel right now with these investors. And so tell me a little bit, obviously AI, as I just mentioned, was kind of a hot topic right now, as we've heard, so much hype in this area. I mean, what do you see, how do you define an AI company today? What sets this category apart?
Yeah, so I think most of the companies that we see, I wouldn't classify as AI companies. I mean, if you're taking, TensorFlow or something off the shelf, training a model, to me, that doesn't make for an AI company. That you're using that as a toolkit in whatever domain, whatever problem you're solving. I think, for me, for something to count as an AI company, you really have to be pushing the boundaries of the problem space. One company that is in our portfolio that I could use would use as an example would be a company called Lighthouse. Think of it as a drop cam that knows what it's looking at. It has a perception system behind it. It's a couple of PhDs out of Stanford, one of whom used to work on the Google Self-Driving car project, and are using a lot of those techniques for home security to cut down on the number of false positives. So the camera knows if it's a dog walking in front of it, or a human, or somebody has seen before or not. So to solve that kind of problem in a form factor that's sitting on a shelf in your house, for example, that is not trivial. That is not something you can just take off the shelf. You need deep expertise in deep learning, in the intersection of hardware and software, really optimizing the machine learning stack. So to me, that's much closer to what makes for an AI first company versus just an applied AI company that's using it as one of the tools.
Yeah, I think that now we see a lot of companies who say, like, use the word AI, maybe to attract investors, have hype. But I think that in general, AI will be pretty horizontal technology, which will be applied almost everywhere. So I less believers that it should be called company AI, specific company or AI related. I just think it's more like underlying technology. Like, you can say mobile company or internet company. Now almost everybody is internet company, almost everybody is mobile company. So the same thing is about AI. So I think it's just a subset of tools which you can apply and use, but it should be not specific category of companies. It is more like technology and horizontal level.
And is that similar to how you're thinking about that at Intel Capital?
Yeah, I think it's somewhat similar. I'm less hung up on, what is AI and which algorithm you're using or whatnot. I think where we spend most of our time thinking through is, hey, is the problem you're solving, an approach you've taken to solving that problem within enterprise or whatever else, can have a step function effect to either improve productivity through like a step function improvement in productivity or revenue or whatever kind of the value driver you're after. whether you're using traditional machine learning or deep learning or whatever else you kind of catch-all buzzword called AI, to me, it's kind of really a secondary question. Primary question is, are you solving a problem that either you're driving a step function improvement in, or maybe you're doing something that just was not possible to do before because of that technology. So that's kind of the filter we are using, less, what is AI and which algorithms and things like that. To me, that's a secondary question.
Got it. And Dmitry, I wanted to move to you first today because we did just have the announcement that Doppler Labs is shutting down. And so I just wanted to ask, there's a lot of interest in smart hardware, and I know that's an area that you invest. Do you think this shutdown will impact on these companies at the intersection of AI and hardware?
So I think that if you can look on whole investment of hardware companies, they have some kind of cycles. Mm-hmm. So maybe like many years ago when Intel was created and some other hardware companies like Hewlett Packard, hardware was very cool, right? At that time, everybody talked about hardware, it was nice. Then later, people start to more and more moving to software, and companies like Microsoft, Oracle was raising. So at that moment, hardware companies became less attractive, and almost all VCs start to, step away from the hardware. Then we have new wave of hardware. You can call it the renaissance of hardware or whatever you call it. I think it's around 2010, 2013 when you see new generation of companies like GoPro, Nest, Dropcam, many of them coming. And suddenly people start to realize, wow, it's an interesting market. Then after 2-3 years, some of this company, Fitbit by the way as well, right? Some of this company go public. And I think in general, people start to understand that not each hardware company is cool, and try to understand what is underlying economics behind hardware companies, right? So I think right now, we believe that hardware, it's not only just selling hardware, it's more like technology which enables some services, and people more and more talk about services. I also think that one very unusual way to think about hardware company is that hardware company is distribution device. So if you're a software company, it's very difficult for you to differentiate. You need to buy advertising, which is very expensive. So to building the device, it became for you like distribution channel. Like for Amazon, Alexa's distribution channel, right? So I think this is where all things are happening, and more people stop to fund just pure hardware companies and more thinking what problem you solve, what service you can build behind it, and especially what is daily pattern of this, how often you use this hardware.
And so kind of a question, maybe we'll start with Ilya. I mean, one of the issues that we saw with this company was the competition that they faced from the big players. I mean, obviously, you see a lot of players like Apple moving into connected with the earbuds, this space. And so how do you think about that just generally with AI as these big public tech companies are investing so heavily in this technology? Where are the biggest opportunities, do you think, for startups?
Sure, yeah. So specifically for hardware, we look for things that have a recurring revenue component attached to them. It's not just a one-time hardware sale. And on the topic of competition, I don't think it's any different for hardware versus any other domain. You always have to be cognizant of competitors, even if you don't have competition today. For sure, you'll have some tomorrow, where you're not in an area that's interesting. For AI specifically, I think the way we think about it is vertical AI. Looking at platforms that do ML as a service, these horizontal plays. That's I think where you're seeing already. You have Amazon, you have Google, you have Microsoft. Rolling out their offerings, that's a tough place to be, typically. But if you're looking at vertical applications where you really go deep in a specific domain, it has to be big enough to make sense as a sort of a venture backable company. But there are plenty of those, and it's unlikely, we think, that Google or Microsoft or any of these big players will go deep into an area like in-store merchandising or something like that.
And Igor, how does that compare to Intel Capital's strategy? As a corporate venture investor, how are you watching, what Microsoft, Google, Facebook are doing as you're investing in AI?
Yeah. So the way this works, right? Yeah. And the way we're thinking about the space, and I think I agree with what Ilya said. There's kind of two categories of companies, right? There's horizontal. I think with this AI as a service, it could be computer vision as a service, text analytics as a service, whatever the case may be. Which is those companies are purely differentiating themselves because they think they can build a better algorithm, more accurate algorithm, etc. I think that's a space that's going to be increasingly hard to differentiate yourself in, and it's going to be increasingly hard to, it's going to get increasingly commoditized by some of the bigger players because that's kind of their core bread and butter, right? And they make it easy, they simplify the infrastructure requirements, etc. So I think it's just hard to compete. Where we think there's going to be a lot of value drivers are, the way I think about it is when the cloud came around, right? That drove a lot of disruption kind of with enterprise applications, right? You had Siebel, you started having Salesforce, et cetera. You can go up and down the stack, and you can say there's probably about $100 billion of enterprise application value got transferred from kind of legacy enterprise applications to the guys who build it as a cloud-first enterprise applications, right? So you could argue the same transition happens again, where there is now, same $100 billion of value will get shifted to the companies that focusing on enterprise by using AI kind of as AI-first type of companies. So I'll give you an example. You buy Salesforce today, you get a Salesforce instance, it comes empty. There's nothing in it. It's a database, it's an empty database. Is there a way for some of those next generation technologies enable you to, when you buy a CRM instance, it already comes pre-populated with what your likely target customers are, or who you should target, who you should call, etc. Right? That's kind of innovation that I think will drive a lot of disruptions within kind of enterprise, and we're spending a lot of time kind of thinking through kind of who those companies are.
And so, Dmitry, kind of along the same lines, I mean, as you're looking at where the tech giants are investing, I also wanted to ask, how is it affecting talent for companies in the AI space? I mean, do you see a lot of the top engineers going after those big salaries that Google or Facebook might be offering rather than starting their own firms?
You're definitely right in terms of the big giants became more active in different spaces. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the fundamental shifts which happened in US is that if you can look 5 years ago, even giants have some kind of focus. Like Google organized global information, like Facebook connecting the people. Right now, I think that US big guys start to use more and more Chinese approach when they do almost everything. Mm. So if you can look in the number of areas they're coming, is very broadly. And there's people sometimes joking that last announce of Amazon killed almost 20 startups at once announcement, right? So they have so much broad of the products. So now it's became very unusual for startups to watching Amazon and say, "Wow, it's me there." So it's changing a lot, and definitely big guys became more doing almost everything. Again, this is our point of view in terms of talent. We agree with you that usually they became very aggressive in terms of hiring the people, and I think that if looking on what kind of benefit of startups versus big companies, I think big companies are very good to do something where you need a lot of engineers. So if you need to apply 5,000-10,000 of engineers, definitely it is not a good idea to you to do similar product, right? Because big guys are doing much better in this thing. But usually if you want to organize 5,000-10,000 people, you create a lot of layers of bureaucracy. It always happens. No matter what kind of strategy you use to organize things, you still became very, very bureaucratic. And this is where I think you can win big companies if you found something small, agile, and particularly try to find some kind of category which you think, for example, that big guys will not going there. Give you an example, I think that gaming and AI in games can be pretty big because I think it's not big chance that big guys will go there, but it's still fundamentally big market. So you should try to find something which you think that big guys will not go, but still have very big market. Example is gaming.
Yeah, and what is an example that you think is maybe an area that you don't see the big guys moving into anytime soon?
I mean, I think there are lots of them. I mean, as big as Google is, they can't do everything.
Sure.
And I think one thing that I would say about big companies competing is I think there's sort of this idea that in order to build an AI company, you have to have lots and lots of data to train the models. and only the big guys have access to lots and lots of data, almost by definition. I think to some extent that's overstated. I think there are lots of places where, yeah, more data always helps, but it tapers off. It asymptotes. And so maybe like the first 30% of the data set gives you like 80 to 90% of the value. And so it's not necessarily the case that you need these giant data sets to really compete. But that's a double-edged sword, because as a startup, if you're pitching that, we have this data moat. We have this, all this data that no one else can get. You know, I tend to be, depending on the kind of the area, I tend to be pretty skeptical that the data moat is the only thing that keeps you defensible and keeps competition out.
And maybe add one more thing. One other strategy is try to be friends with big giants, right? For example, right now, I know it's tough sometimes, but like if you see like big war between like Google and Amazon, for example, like Google now spent a lot of resources to bring Google Assistant everywhere. And make this kind of ecosystem around Alexa and Google Assistant pretty big. So if you found this kind of business model, which became part of Google Assistant or part of Alexa, and try to use some specific problems when you will be friends with them, you can leverage this kind of growth together. It can be one of the strategies.
Yeah, maybe just, you know, I'll make one joke and then one serious comment. You know what Amazon says about their ecosystem? You know, they love our ecosystem, it's so yummy, right? Because they're gonna all, you know, eat it up at some point. But, that wasn't a good joke, apparently. But on the more serious note, you know, you take an example like Amazon. There was actually no reason why a startup couldn't have done the same thing. There was actually no fundamental advantage that Amazon had in building Amazon Echo. Yeah, maybe they had a distribution channel, which was pretty significant, but that's about it. They had no fundamental technology advantage. They had no fundamental data advantage. But they just, you know, so there was no fundamental reason why a startup couldn't have done that. So I think there's plenty of, you know, kind of blue ocean areas where you can still find areas to innovate, despite kind of the big four guys being there.
And we can't have a panel about AI without talking about the potential dark side of the technology. I mean, there's a lot of discussion around what AI might do to jobs. And I'm just kind of curious, you know, as investors in this space, what do you think the impact of AI will be on, you know, jobs moving forward? And do you think as investors you have a responsibility to mitigate some of the negative impacts that it could have on people like truck drivers or radiologists whose jobs might be directly competitive with some of the technologies we're seeing come out?
You know, I think there was a lot of discussion about this kind of topic, but I think there is also one other interesting part of this discussion is also relationship between consumers and AI and robotics companies, right? For example, one of the interesting things is that when you call somewhere, like call center, maybe the like AI have legal responsibility to say I'm AI, I'm not person, because sometimes people like consumer may confuse it, right? So. And they're calling, asking some questions. So, like, oh, Alexa, for example. If you talk to Alexa, you see it's Alexa. But if you're calling by phone, you don't know is it like robot or it's real person. And the more technology is better, and sometimes you have maybe even better feeling to talk to AI. For example, if you have some kind of personal healthcare question, you maybe want to talk not to person, maybe you want to talk to AI because you know it's like no judgment in your case, right? So, it's I think that. Very big topic will be how relationship between AI and robotics companies, between consumer and them, and how this interface will be established like long term, right?
And is that something you talk about your companies with as you're advising them
it's more like because we see many tests and how people interact. We see that sometimes people really don't know they operate with the robots or the people, right? They sometimes really think it's person, and in one case it's advantage. And sometimes it's like disadvantage, right? So, and it's pretty interesting fundamental question. Should like self-driving car say, okay, at that moment it's not person driving the car, it's like robot driving the car, or if you do any recommendation, or if you do like almost everything, right? So this is pretty big fundamental question, and we do some survey of consumers. There is cases when consumers are happier that it's person. But there is cases when consumers much happier if it's like AI or like machine behind it. And it's pretty unusual thinking behind it.
Yeah, you know, I was listening to another panel. This whole thing about the robot-human interaction is pretty interesting. I was listening to another panel some weeks ago, and they were talking about, hey, if you're building a consumer robot, you better not give it any hands, because if a robot has hands, it looks threatening to customers or clients. So you don't give it any hands, right? Better for you. But you know, on your question around kind of replacing the workforce and things like that, I think it's probably overhyped in the short term, maybe underhyped in the long term. I'll give you a couple examples, right? So, you know, early 20th century, there was something like millions of phone operators that would just, you know, connect people when they make phone calls. You know, and people say, well, oh man, what's going to happen once, you know, all these people don't have jobs, and kind of nothing happened. They all found different jobs, right? You know, somebody else was giving examples. You know, 200 years ago, we would all be farmers, and you know, so I think those transitions will happen. You know, I think we're probably in a long ways away where, you know, doesn't need to be a human in the loop for most of these things. So I think it's, like I said, I think it's overhyped in the short term, maybe underhyped in a very long term. Yeah.
And so do you as an investor, I mean, do you think you need to play any role to help mitigate what that long-term effect might be?
I think that horizon is so long. I don't think any of us as investors can really impact that in any meaningful way. I think we're talking about 100-year kind of horizons. I don't think it's, hey, beyond most of our investment periods, I'd say.
I mean, what about your perspective? I mean, obviously for a group like truck drivers, I mean, it's one of the largest jobs in the US, and you see more and more companies focusing on self-driving. Do you agree with that position?
Yeah, so I think that, you know, actually self-driving trucks, I think, are pretty close. You know, I think highway driving is a much easier problem than urban driving. And so I think, you know, trucks that can at least drive themselves along the highway and the last mile is maybe done by a human are going to be pretty close. I guess what I would say is, you know, something like that, you'd have to believe that, you know, it's different this time because our economy has gone through many cycles like this, and you don't have to go back 100 years. I mean, if you look at dock workers with the advent of the shipping container, you know, I think dock workers, longshoremen, stevedores was one of the largest sort of employers of males in the U.S. As recently as the 1950s and 60s, and the shipping container just wiped that out. And you know, the economy was able to make that transition, and I think, you know, with something like truck drivers, it doesn't feel to me like it's all that different. You know, the numbers are roughly similar, and the type of job you're replacing is roughly similar. I would think that you'd be able to sort of find another place for those people. For sure, it'll be painful for some, but you know, if you imagine like what that will enable, the cost of shipping will drop drastically. What other types of opportunities does that open up in the economy? What other types of businesses are able to exist in that world that can't exist now because shipping is so expensive? I think that's the thing that people sort of don't focus on as much as they focus on the losses. But then this creative destruction, like they focus on the destruction, but what is the creative part? And I think typically, historically, there's been a lot more creation than destruction, although it's painful in the short term.
Do you see any early signs of that long-term creation? I mean, any new opportunities that are coming up because of maybe companies you've invested in?
So I think it's a little bit too early on sort of playing the parlay of, you know, self-driving trucks are going to happen and I'm going to do something else. But I do think on sort of a 5 to 10 year time horizon, that will happen. So not yet, but you know, we have companies, the way we've chosen to invest, or I guess play that theme, is we're investing in companies that will benefit from that, but are not reliant on it. So, you know, for example, we have a logistics company that would hugely benefit from self-driving trucks because the cost of the human driver is one of the largest costs in transportation, but it can work just fine without that.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. So I agree with guys that short term it will not happen, but I think still it's a pretty fundamental question: what will happen later? And definitely, speed of technology is accelerating, and I like the analogy of looking at the history. If you can look on history, almost all the time we already have examples how people change the type of the jobs on massive scale. But on the other side, we have acceleration of technology, so we need to have some kind of other solution. And I try to think creatively what we can do as a society, as governments, or anywhere. And I think the most realistic approach from my side is decrease number of working days. Because if technology will accelerating, and by the way, it's happening already in the beginning of 20th century. We have 6 days of work. And then, because technology became better, we start to have 5. So next evolution will be to have 4 working days and 3 days of weekend. And this fundamental approach, I think, is the best because government can't allow massive people be unemployed. And this is, I think, the historically right approach to moving in this direction. So my belief, if all this technology thinking that speed of technology innovation will accelerate, if it's happened, and people will have not enough time to change the jobs, we're moving to 3 days of weekend.
I like the idea of that.
No, I think I hope that government will follow my advice. This is just a way of thinking. You have, and by the way, if it happens, you need to put more money in entertainment because if you have 3 days of rest, you have more entertainment, right? And we already have historical example how it's happened.
Interesting. But do you think that politicians are paying enough attention to the short-term effects that this could have right now?
Seems like they were paying a lot of attention this past campaign. I mean, I think as far as I can tell, Trump won because he played that theme.
And so also just we're kind of coming to the end of our time together, so I wanted to maybe take some time for some rapid fire questions. So just some one-word answers right now. First question I wanted to ask is, where is an unexpected place that you're seeing a lot of AI talent right now as investors?
Italy.
Place or some kind of field? Like
A city or country?
City or country? I think it's Hong Kong.
Yeah, what I think was surprised, maybe just because I'm misinformed, was Canada. I was actually surprised by.
Why are you surprised?
Like I said, maybe just because, like I said, maybe just because I was misinformed. But
All right, and then just going along with the title of our panel, is AI hyped or undervalued?
that's like the easiest question you asked all day.
Hard to say in one. I would say so I would separate into, there's like the low stakes AI where it's okay if you make a mistake, like showing ads. And there's high stakes AI where, if you screw up, somebody dies. I think high stakes AI is overhyped. I think there's a lot more work to do there before it comes to reality. I think the low stakes AIs, if anything, is underhyped.
My answer is both.
Both.
No, I'm a simple. From a venture standpoint, it's definitely not undervalued. Yeah.
And so kind of along that line, do you think that venture funding in AI will go up or down in 2018?
Up. I don't know.
If I would have to guess, I'd say probably up, and then it will go down.
Oh, you know it.
I don't, but you tell me what I think.
Got it. And what is one AI company that should be on everyone's radar in this room? And if you could help me out and give me one that you didn't invest in yourself.
I won't fall into that trap.
Well, I had one in mind, but it's in our portfolio, so now I need a minute to think about it.
I can mention category, not one company, but category, I think AI in gaming.
I mean, maybe imagery, like satellite imagery, something like that. There's a few companies in that space, interesting space. Maybe that's an area that is interesting to look at.
Any standouts that?
Yeah, there are a few companies. I mean, I'll mention one that we've talked to, Descartes Labs.
Yeah, I think the place where we have not made an investment yet, but I think we should and we will at some point, is healthcare and kind of application of AI in kind of specific around imaging. I think there's a bunch of companies out there. I won't name anyone because I don't, maybe counterproductive, but that's a space we probably will make. I think there's some step function effect you can achieve in that space, so we'll probably make some bets there.
Got it. Well, great. Well, thank you all for joining us today for the panel. It's been really interesting discussion.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.